February 5th, 2003. United Nations Security Council. Every camera in the world pointed at one man holding a small glass vial. Colin Powell, United States Secretary of State, told the planet that this tiny tube represented the anthrax Saddam Hussein could deploy to kill thousands. The evidence was classified. The threat was imminent. The invasion was necessary. 18 months later, after the most extensive weapons search in military history, inspectors found nothing. No biological weapons, no chemical stockpiles, no nuclear program. The vial was a prop. The source, codenamed Curveball, was a fabricator. The whole presentation was theater. But here is what they never told you. Saddam Hussein did possess a weapon. Not anthrax, not nerve gas, not uranium. His weapon was a currency decision. And that decision signed his death warrant 3 years before Powell ever stepped into that chamber. You were told this war was about weapons of mass destruction. Then you were told it was about democracy. Then you were told it was about humanitarian intervention. Every explanation crumbled under examination. But there was one explanation that never made it to your television screen. One explanation that explains the timing, the urgency, the $3 trillion price tag, and why the first administrative action after invasion was not about weapons or democracy. It was about converting Iraqi oil sales from euros back to dollars. The question is simple. Can an empire invade a country just because it changed the currency it uses to sell oil? The answer should terrify you, because in 2003, that is exactly what happened. To understand why Saddam had to die, you need to understand the machine that gives America its power. Not its military, not its technology, not its culture. The machine is called the Petrodollar System, and it was built in 1974 in the desert between Richard Nixon and the King of Saudi Arabia. Here is how it works. After Nixon destroyed the gold standard in 1971, the dollar had no anchor, no commodity backing it, nothing forcing the world to hold it. The dollar was just paper, and America was printing it faster than ever to fund Vietnam and domestic spending. Inflation was exploding. The currency was dying. Nixon and Henry Kissinger needed a new anchor. They found it in oil. In 1974, they made a deal with Saudi Arabia. America would provide military protection, weapons, and political support. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would do two things. First, sell oil only in US dollars. Second, invest surplus oil revenues in US Treasury bonds. The other OPEC nations followed. Overnight, this changed everything. If you wanted oil, you needed dollars. If you needed dollars, you had to sell something to America or hold dollar reserves. If you held dollar reserves, you bought US Treasury bonds. This system meant that every country on earth was suddenly financing American debt, whether they wanted to or not. The petrodollar system became the hidden engine of American empire. It allowed the United States to run massive trade deficits without consequences. It allowed the Federal Reserve to print money without destroying the currency. It allowed America to borrow over $30 trillion and counting, because the world had no choice but to recycle that money back into U.S. assets. This was not just about oil. This was about creating artificial demand for dollars. As long as oil was priced in dollars, America could export inflation and import goods indefinitely. The whole world became a captive market for American debt. But the system had one vulnerability. It required everyone to play along. If a major oil producer decided to sell in a different currency, the entire structure could fracture. Other countries might follow. Dollar demand would collapse. Treasury bonds would flood the market. Interest rates would explode. The $30 trillion debt mountain would become unpayable. The petrodollar system only works if it is universal. One defection is a crack. Multiple defections are a collapse. Enter Saddam Hussein. By the year 2000, Saddam was already a pariah. Iraq had been under sanctions since the Gulf War. The Oil for Food program allowed limited exports under UN supervision. Saddam was boxed in, isolated, economically strangled. Then, in November 2000, he made a decision. Iraq would begin selling its oil in euros instead of dollars. This was not a minor policy shift. This was a direct attack on the financial architecture of American power. Saddam was not just changing his currency. He was publicly demonstrating that the petrodollar system was optional. He was proving that an oil producer could defy the dollar and survive. And for a while, it worked. The euro was rising against the dollar. Iraq was actually making more money on the exchange rate. Other countries were watching closely. Iran was considering a similar move. Venezuela was making noise about currency alternatives. Russia was paying attention. Saddam had discovered the empire's secret. He had shown that the emperor's currency had no clothes. Now you might think this is speculation. You might think no government would invade a country over oil pricing. Let me show you the evidence. In 2007, Alan Greenspan, former chairman of the Federal Reserve, published his memoir. In it, he wrote this exact sentence: "I'm saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows. The Iraq War is largely about oil." Greenspan was not talking about stealing oil. He was talking about control. control over the pricing mechanism, control over the currency of sale, control over the system that allows America to print money without immediate inflation. He knew. They all knew. Now watch what happened after the invasion. March 2003. American forces enter Baghdad. Saddam's regime collapses. Chaos erupts across the country. Looting, fires, total breakdown of order. Museums are ransacked, hospitals are destroyed. $12 billion in cash vanishes into the Iraqi night, never to be recovered. But amid all this chaos, one action was taken immediately and with perfect clarity. June 2003. The Coalition Provisional Authority, the American-run transitional government, issues an order. All Iraqi oil sales will be conducted in US dollars. Not euros, dollars. This was not the 10th priority, not the 20th. This was one of the first administrative decisions made after regime change, before reconstructing infrastructure, before establishing security, before anything resembling democracy. The oil currency was switched back. If the war was about weapons of mass destruction, why was this the priority? If the war was about liberation, why did currency mechanics come before electricity and clean water? If the war was about democracy, why was the first economic decision made by an unelected American administrator? The answer is in the action itself. The Petrodollar System had been attacked. The attack had been neutralized. The example had been made. Let us examine the costs. The war killed over 100,000 Iraqi civilians. Conservative estimates. Some studies suggest the number exceeds 500,000 when you include indirect deaths from collapsed infrastructure and medical systems. Thousands of American soldiers died. Tens of thousands came home with injuries that will never fully heal. The financial cost reached $3 trillion when you include long-term veteran care and interest on borrowed war funding. $3 trillion borrowed against future American taxpayers to restore a currency system that most Americans do not even know exists. That $3 trillion was not destroyed. It was transferred. Defense contractors made record profits. Oil service companies like Halliburton secured no-bid contracts worth billions. Private military firms multiplied. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about in 1961 reached its full maturity. This is the Cantillon effect at the scale of empire. Money is created at the top through borrowing and Fed policy. It flows to politically connected industries first. By the time it reaches the general population, prices have already risen. The wealth is extracted through inflation and debt service that will burden generations. The war was profitable, just not for you. You need to understand something crucial. This was not the last time. This was the first warning shot. After Saddam, other countries learned the lesson. But they also learned something else. They learned that the system can be challenged if you are powerful enough or coordinated enough. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency called the dinar in 2009. He wanted to sell Libyan oil for this new currency instead of dollars or euros. By 2011, NATO was bombing Tripoli. Gaddafi was dead. Libya remains a failed state. Its oil is back in Western currency terms. Iran has been trying to sell oil in non-dollar currencies for years. It faces the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a nation. Not because of its nuclear program, that is the cover story, because it is trying to create alternative payment systems. Venezuela, despite having the world's largest proven oil reserves, has been economically strangled and subjected to regime change attempts. Why? Because it started accepting UN and other currencies for oil. Because it joined alternative financial systems. Because it tried to exit the dollar sphere. Russia and China are now building their own payment systems. The cross-border interbank payment system. Digital UN. Bilateral trade agreements that bypass the dollar entirely. This is not anti-American ideology. This is financial self-defense. They watched what happened to Saddam. They watched what happened to Gaddafi. They know the cost of defiance, but they also know that together they might be too big to invade. The pattern is clear once you see it. It stretches back through history, beyond the petrodollar, beyond America. Empires have always destroyed threats to their monetary systems. Rome debased its currency, but executed anyone who refused to accept it. Britain enforced the gold standard with gunships. The Spanish Empire melted down indigenous gold and silver, not for wealth alone, but to control the monetary system of the New World. Currency is power. Whoever controls what people must use to trade controls the economy itself. The petrodollar system is just the modern version of an ancient truth. Challenge the empire's money, and the empire will come for you. Now, let me be clear about something. Saddam Hussein was not a hero. He was a brutal dictator who used chemical weapons against his own people. He invaded Kuwait. He tortured dissidents. He ran a totalitarian police state. But that's not why he died. Dozens of dictators operate around the world right now. Some are American allies. Some receive weapons and financial support despite horrific human rights records. The difference is not their moral character. The difference is whether they threaten the financial system. Saddam was not killed for his crimes. He was killed for his currency decision. Everything else was narrative construction. The weapons of mass destruction, the mushroom cloud warnings, the links to terrorism that never existed. All of it was the story they needed to tell to get public permission for what they had already decided to do. The trial that sentenced Saddam to death never mentioned oil. It never mentioned euros. It never mentioned the petrodollar. Those words do not appear in the official record, but they appear in the timeline. They appear in the administrative actions. They appear in Alan Greenspan's memoir. The evidence does not lie. It just gets ignored. So what does this mean for you? Why does a war that started over 20 years ago matter now? Because the same system is still operating. The same incentives exist. The same vulnerabilities remain. America's debt is now over $34 trillion. The only reason this has not caused a currency crisis is because the petrodollar system still functions. Oil still trades primarily in dollars. Central banks still hold dollars as reserves. The machine still runs, but it is showing cracks. More countries are making bilateral deals in local currencies. More oil is being sold in yuan. More nations are building alternative financial infrastructure. The BRICS countries are actively working to create a parallel system. They remember Saddam. They remember Gaddafi. They are moving carefully, but they are moving. The question is, what happens when the system finally breaks? When enough countries defect that dollar demand collapses? When treasury bonds flood the market and nobody wants to buy them? When the $34 trillion debt becomes unpayable in real terms? That moment has not arrived yet. But every alternative currency deal brings it closer. Every sanction applied pushes more countries toward alternatives. Every frozen asset, every swift disconnection, every weaponization of the dollar system makes other nations realize they need an exit strategy. The empire built on petrodollars is defending itself the only way it knows how. With force, with sanctions, with regime change operations, with monetary warfare. But force has limits, especially when your opponents have nuclear weapons and your own country is exhausted from 20 years of forever wars. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. Rome could not sustain its empire once the silver content of its coins dropped too low. Britain could not maintain the gold standard after World War I drained its reserves. Every empire that based its power on monetary control eventually faced the same problem. The system works until it does not, and then it collapses faster than anyone expects. The petrodollar system gave America 50 years of unparalleled power. It allowed a standard of living built on importing more than exporting. It allowed military bases in over 70 countries. It allowed borrowing that would bankrupt any other nation. But systems built on force and dependency are inherently unstable. They require constant maintenance, constant enforcement, constant examples made of those who step out of line. Saddam Hussein was one of those examples. He was not the first. He will not be the last. You were never supposed to understand this. The official narrative is simpler. Bad dictator had dangerous weapons. We stopped him. Mission accomplished. That story is clean. It fits in a headline. It does not require you to understand monetary systems or geopolitical strategy or the actual incentives driving foreign policy. But the official story fell apart. The weapons were never found. The democracy never arrived. Iraq is still broken. The mission was never accomplished. What did happen is that Iraqi oil went back to being sold in dollars. What did happen is that the challenge to the petrodollar was eliminated. What did happen is that every other oil-producing nation learned what happens when you try to leave the system. The math is simple, the timeline is clear, the evidence is documented. The only thing missing is the courage to look at it. I'm not telling you what to think, I'm showing you where to look. The documents are public. Alan Greenspan's memoir is available. The timeline of the euro switch and the dollar switchback is recorded. The cost of the war is calculated. The absence of weapons is confirmed. Connect the dots yourself. But once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand how the petrodollar system works, you understand why certain wars happen and others do not. Why certain dictators are allies and others are targets. Why some human rights abuses are ignored and others trigger interventions. It is not about morality. It is about the system, and the system protects itself by any means necessary. Saddam Hussein made a choice in November 2000. He decided Iraq would sell oil in euros. 30 months later, American tanks were in Baghdad. 18 months after that, he was on trial. 3 years after that, he was executed. The official reason was crimes against humanity. The real reason was crimes against the dollar. This is not conspiracy theory. This is monetary history. The conspiracy is pretending it was ever about anything else. History hides the answers in plain sight. I'm just showing you where the bodies are buried, and in this case, the body is hanging from a rope in a Baghdad prison cell, executed for threatening the machine that runs the world. The empire does not forgive currency rebellion. It never has. It never will. If this analysis changed how you see modern conflicts, subscribe to this channel. If you want to understand the systems that shape your world, hit the like button. The algorithms hide content like this. Your engagement is the only way these patterns reach more people. The truth is not hidden because it is secret. It is hidden because most people never ask the right questions. Start asking. Start looking. Start connecting. And remember, every time you hear about a new conflict, a new threat, a new enemy that must be stopped, ask yourself one question. What does this have to do with the dollar? The answer will tell you everything the news will not.